The sea was unusually still that morning, as if holding its breath. The tide had crept in with an eerie silence, leaving the docks coated in a wet sheen that glimmered faintly in the early light. It was the kind of day that made even the most seasoned fishermen uneasy, though none would dare admit it. Instead, they grumbled about the shifting weather and the chill in the air, casting nervous glances toward the horizon. That's when they first noticed it, a faint line, far out at sea, like a wisp of smoke caught against the pale blue sky. At first, it seemed harmless, a curious trick of light or mist. But as the day wore on, the fog rolled closer, slow and deliberate, as if it were being guided toward the village by some unseen force. Old Tom, who had spent more years on the water than anyone else in the village, squinted at the approaching fog with a furrowed brow. His gnarled hands tightened around the handle of his net as he muttered under his breath. "That ain't natural," he said to no one in particular. "A fog like that don't belong here." No one disagreed with him. By midday, the fog was pressing at the edges of the village, thick and white, curling over the docks like cold fingers. It hung heavy in the air, muffling the usual sounds of gulls and lapping waves. The sea itself seemed to retreat from it, as if even the waters were afraid to touch what lay within. Children, usually full of energy, lingered near their homes, watching with wide eyes as the mist slithered through the narrow streets. Mothers called them inside, their voices tinged with nervousness. But it wasn't just the fog that unsettled them. There was something else, something beneath the surface, a sound that grew louder as the mist thickened. At first, it was hardly noticeable, a faint hum, almost like the distant moan of the wind. But as the fog pressed closer, the hum became more distinct, more deliberate. It resonated in the bones, low and constant, like a pulse of something ancient and alive. Mrs. Thorne, who lived nearest to the shore, was the first to step out into the thickening fog. Her long gray shawl fluttered in the breeze as she peered out into the mist, her weathered face scrunched in confusion. She could swear she heard voices in the fog, whispering, calling, yet there was no one to be seen. The fisherman's bell, usually hanging silent and still, clanged softly in the distance, though there was no wind strong enough to move it. Just the fog, and that strange, insistent hum. Hours passed, and the village remained frozen in a strange, uneasy silence. The fishermen refused to set out, their boats tied down as the fog swallowed the shore. No one dared venture out any farther than their doorsteps. Even the animals seemed to sense the strangeness in the air. The village dogs paced in circles, growling low at nothing, while the seagulls, usually so bold, had taken to the skies, disappearing inland. By nightfall, the fog had enveloped the entire village. It was so thick that the houses on the other side of the street were no longer visible, just vague shadows blurred by the mist. The hum had grown louder, almost unbearable now, filling the air with a sense of foreboding. Some claimed they could hear whispers inside it, faint, unintelligible voices that seemed to rise and fall with the fog's rhythm. And then, as the moon began to rise behind a veil of clouds, the first scream echoed through the mist. It was distant, muffled by the fog, but unmistakable. A sharp, ragged cry that chilled the blood and made the heart race. Doors slammed shut as villagers hurried to lock themselves inside. No one saw who had screamed. No one dared venture out to see. But the fog lingered, thick and silent now, its whispers drifting through the village like a slow, creeping promise of what was yet to come. By morning, the village was a hushed shadow of itself. No one spoke of the scream that had cut through the night, though every face showed signs of a restless, haunted sleep. The fog remained, a thick, unyielding wall that blurred the world beyond a few feet in any direction. The village felt smaller now, claustrophobic, as though the fog were slowly pressing in on them from all sides. A fisherman named Garrett was the first to go missing. It was his wife, Ellen, who noticed. She woke to find the bed empty, the sheets cold, and Garrett's coat missing from the hook by the door. At first, she wasn't worried. Garrett often rose early to check his boat, especially on days like these when the weather felt wrong. But as the hours dragged on and the fog showed no sign of lifting, a gnawing unease settled deep in her chest. By midday, the village had gathered at the docks, though few dared step too close to the edge where the fog loomed thickest. Ellen stood there, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, staring into the mist as though she could will Garrett to appear. "He's never stayed out this long," she murmured, more to herself than to the others. Old Tom shuffled closer, his weathered face pale beneath the brim of his hat. "Maybe he got turned around," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The fog could do that to a man, confuse him, make him lose his way. But Garrett knew these waters as well as anyone. He shouldn't have gotten lost. The hours passed with no sign of him. Ellen's worry turned to panic, and soon, several of the village men were heading toward Garrett's boat, tethered at the end of the dock. It was there, all right, still tied down just as he'd left it. But there was no trace of Garrett himself, no sign he had ever boarded it. They called his name, their voices swallowed by the mist. But the fog didn't answer. It didn't stir. It simply hung there, thick and suffocating, absorbing their shouts like a living thing, feeding on their fear. Later that afternoon, little Meg, a girl of no more than 6, vanished from the square. She'd been playing near the old well, her wooden doll clutched tightly in her hand, while her mother sold apples at the market. One moment she was there, her laughter soft but clear despite the fog. The next, the square was silent, the only sound the faint rustling of skirts and the distant hum of the sea. Her mother's scream pierced the village, drawing everyone to the square. But Meg was gone. The fog, once again, had swallowed her without a trace. The villagers searched, of course. They combed the streets, the alleys, the fields near the woods. They called her name until their voices grew hoarse, but Meg had disappeared as if she had never existed at all. There were no footprints, no signs of struggle, just the thick, suffocating fog clinging to everything, its strange, low hum still buzzing in the background like a maddening echo. That evening, the village gathered in the church, a small, drafty building near the edge of the village. Father Emery, a quiet, serious man, led the prayers, though his words did little to ease the rising panic. The fog had taken 2 of their own in a single day, and everyone knew it. No one said it aloud, but the fear in their eyes spoke volumes. As night fell once more, no one lingered outside. Doors were bolted shut, windows latched tightly, and candles were lit in every home. The fog curled around the houses like a living thing, pressing against the glass, whispering its silent threats. In the darkness, Ellen sat by her window, staring out into the mist. She didn't blink, didn't move. Somewhere out there, her husband was lost. Somewhere out there, little Meg was wandering alone. But no one dared go after them. Not anymore. The fog had come to claim them, and it wouldn't stop at just 2. It was only the beginning. By the 3rd day, the village had changed. Where once there had been laughter, chatter, and the sound of the sea, now there was only silence and the fog. It clung to the streets, heavier than ever, curling around the houses in thick, pale tendrils. No one ventured outside unless they absolutely had to, and even then they stayed close to the walls, never straying too far from their homes. It wasn't just the fear of disappearing. It was something else, something moving within the fog. Late in the night, when the village was still, those who lay awake swore they could see shapes shifting in the mist. Dark figures, almost human, but not quite. They moved slowly, their outlines blurred and distorted by the fog. But there was something undeniably wrong about them. They were too tall, too thin, and their movements were unnatural, jerky, as if they didn't quite understand how to walk. Martha, the innkeeper, was the first to speak of it aloud. She'd seen it from her window, a figure standing at the edge of the inn's courtyard, just barely visible in the mist. It hadn't moved for what felt like hours, just stood there, watching. She had tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light, but the next morning she found footprints leading from the courtyard into the fog. Large, deep prints, not human. Others began to share their stories. Some had seen the figures at night, drifting through the streets, their vague forms barely distinguishable from the swirling mist around them. They never came too close, but they were always there, watching, waiting. One by one, the villagers retreated into their homes, closing their shutters tight and avoiding the windows. But even behind locked doors, the sense of being watched never left. The fog pressed against the glass like a living thing, obscuring the world outside, but not enough to hide the shadows. It was old Tom who finally suggested gathering a group to investigate. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening, whatever was inside the fog, wouldn't stop until they confronted it. The villagers were hesitant at first. No one wanted to risk being taken like Garrett or little Meg. But as the fog thickened and the whispers grew louder, they knew something had to be done. That afternoon, a group of 5 men set out. Tom led them, his weathered face set in determination, though even he seemed wary of the thickening mist. Behind him were 2 younger fishermen, Matthew and Edgar, and a pair of blacksmiths from the edge of the village, strong and capable with heavy tools strapped to their backs. They each carried lanterns, though the weak light barely pierced the fog. They moved slowly, the fog swirling around their legs like water, each step cautious and deliberate. The hum in the air was louder now, a constant vibration that seemed to come from all around them. And with each step, the sense of unease deepened, as though they were walking straight into the heart of something far older, far darker than any of them could understand. "I saw something out here last night," Tom muttered, his voice low, almost drowned out by the mist. "Near the docks. Couldn't tell what it was, but it was big. Too big to be human." The others exchanged nervous glances but said nothing. They'd all seen the shadows. They all knew something was out there. As they neared the docks, the fog seemed to grow thicker, almost solid, and the hum grew louder, pulsing in their ears like a heartbeat. Then, just ahead, a shape began to form. At first it was nothing more than a vague outline in the mist, but as they moved closer it became clearer, tall, twisted, and not quite right. The figure stood motionless at the water's edge, its back turned to them. It was human-shaped, but wrong. Its limbs too long, its posture unnaturally stiff. For a moment, none of them dared move. Then, without warning, the figure shifted. It turned its head, slowly, deliberately, toward them. In the pale light of their lanterns, they saw its face, or rather, the lack of one. Where its eyes should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin, stretched tight over a skull-like head. Its mouth, if it had one, was hidden by the fog that swirled around its face. For a moment, the group stood frozen, horror rippling through them. And then, as if it sensed their fear, the figure began to move, its limbs jerking unnaturally as it stepped toward them. "Run!" Old Tom's voice broke the silence, and without another word they turned and fled, the lantern swinging wildly in the mist as the figure melted back into the fog. But even as they ran, they could hear it behind them, its heavy, unnatural footsteps growing louder with every passing second. Something had followed them out of the fog, something that would not stop until it claimed them all. The group burst through the doors of the village hall, breathless and shaken. Old Tom slammed the door behind them, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the latch. The others stood in stunned silence, their faces pale, eyes wide with the horror of what they had seen. No one spoke for several long moments, the air thick with the weight of unspoken fear. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, swirling in slow, languid patterns as though it were alive, watching. The steady hum was louder now, vibrating through the walls, a constant oppressive sound that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. It was as if the fog itself was breathing, waiting for its next move. Father Amori was the first to speak, his voice low and troubled. "What did you see?" he asked, his eyes flicking between the men. His usually calm demeanor had crumbled in the past few days, and now he looked as worn and afraid as the rest of them. Old Tom wiped the sweat from his brow, shaking his head. "It wasn't human," he whispered. "Whatever that thing was, it came from the fog. I swear it." The other men nodded, their faces drawn with fear. No one doubted Tom's words. They had all seen it, felt the cold dread that had gripped them when the faceless figure had turned toward them. But it wasn't just the figure that haunted their thoughts. It was the fog itself. It seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as though something far more sinister lurked within its depths. It was then that the old legends resurfaced, stories long buried beneath the surface of the village's history. Tales of a fog that came with the sea, bringing death to all it touched. Martha, the innkeeper, had grown up in the village, and though she rarely spoke of the past, she now stepped forward, her voice steady but laced with fear. "I remember my grandmother telling me stories," she began, her eyes distant as if recalling some long-forgotten nightmare. "She used to say that the fog comes when the sea is angry. It's a warning, a sign that something terrible is about to happen." The room fell silent as her words sank in. No one had ever taken the old story seriously, not until now. But the disappearances, the shadows in the fog, the unnatural creatures, they were all too real to ignore. Father Emery frowned, his brow furrowed in thought. What exactly did she say about the fog? Martha hesitated, her fingers twisting in the hem of her apron. "There was a legend, passed down through the generations," she said softly. "The village wasn't always here. Long before this place was sacred ground, a place where rituals were performed to keep something at bay. Something from the sea. A curse," Tom muttered, his voice grim. "That's what this is." Martha nodded slowly. The old story spoke of a bargain made with the sea itself. Long ago, the villagers offered sacrifices to the water, to appease whatever lurked beneath. But one year, the sacrifices stopped. No one knows why. And ever since, the fog returns. A heavy silence settled over the room, broken only by the soft hum of the fog outside. The weight of the past hung over them like a shroud, the truth of their village's history finally emerging from the shadows. The fog wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was the manifestation of something ancient, something forgotten. "What do we do?" Edgar asked, his voice small, like that of a child lost in a nightmare. How do we stop it? Father Emery sighed, his hand resting on the worn Bible that lay on the table beside him. If the stories are true, there may be no stopping it, he said quietly. But we need to understand what we're dealing with. There has to be a reason it's come now. Tom stood suddenly, his chair scraping loudly across the floor. We need to go to the old lighthouse, he said, his voice filled with a grim determination. That's where it all started. My grandfather used to say the fog always came from there, out at sea. Maybe there's something we've missed, something that can tell us why this is happening. The lighthouse had been abandoned for years, its crumbling structure standing like a sentinel at the edge of the cliffs, overlooking the sea. Few dared to go near it anymore. It had become a place of superstition, its once gleaming light long extinguished. But now, it seemed like their only hope. We'll leave at dawn, Tom declared, his eyes hard. If there's anything left in this village worth saving, we'll find it there. The others nodded in agreement, though none of them could shake the feeling that the lighthouse held answers they might not want to find. Outside, the fog thickened, pressing against the windows as though it knew what they were planning. The sea's secrets had remained hidden for generations, but now, as the fog crept closer and the shadows danced in its depths, those secrets were clawing their way to the surface. And whatever waited for them at the lighthouse would be far worse than anything they had yet imagined. The dawn came shrouded in gray, the sun nothing more than a faint, pale glow behind the impenetrable fog. It was as though the world had forgotten how to be bright. The village, now nearly deserted, was deathly quiet. No one dared step outside. No one spoke of the missing. The fog had stolen not just lives, but the spirit of the village itself, leaving behind only a creeping sense of dread. Tom and the others gathered at the edge of town, their faces set in grim determination. Each man carried a lantern, though the weak light barely penetrated the dense mist swirling around them. The path to the lighthouse, once a well-worn trail along the cliffs, was now lost to the fog. They would have to trust their instincts and each other to find their way. Old Tom took the lead, his steps slow and measured. Behind him were Matthew, Edgar, and Father Emery. None of them spoke as they ventured into the thickening fog, the hum growing louder with each step, like a dark heartbeat pulsing in the air. The sea below was hidden, its usual roar muffled by the mist, leaving only a deadened silence. It felt as though they were walking into another world, one that didn't belong to them. The lighthouse loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette barely visible through the fog. It stood tall and foreboding, a crumbling monument to a forgotten time. The air around it was different, colder, heavier. As they approached, the ground beneath their feet felt wrong, the stones slick with moisture that seemed more than just the dampness of the mist. No one's been here in years, Matthew whispered, his voice swallowed by the fog. He glanced around, his eyes wide with unease. The place reeked of abandonment, but there was something else, an unnatural stillness that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Tom nodded but said nothing. His eyes were fixed on the entrance to the lighthouse, a gaping black mouth that seemed to beckon them inside. They stepped across the threshold, the interior cold and damp, the walls streaked with mold and salt. The smell of decay clung to the air, heavy and oppressive. Inside, the silence was even more suffocating. The walls, once whitewashed, were now stained with the passage of time, and the spiral staircase that led to the top creaked under their weight. As they ascended, the hum in the air seemed to grow louder, vibrating through the stones, echoing in their bones. At the top, They found the source of the light that had once guided ships safely to shore. The great lantern was shattered, its glass broken, the rusted mechanism long dead. Wind howled through the cracks in the stone, a mournful sound that seemed to carry the voices of the lost. But that wasn't what drew their attention. In the center of the room, etched into the stone floor, was a circle, a large, intricate design that spiraled outward in strange, twisting patterns. Symbols none of them recognized were carved into the stone, their edges worn but still visible. In the middle of the circle lay something small, glistening in the faint light, a silver pendant, its surface engraved with the same markings that adorned the floor. Father Emery knelt beside it, his brow furrowed. This is no ordinary symbol, he murmured, his fingers hovering over the pendant without touching it. It's ancient. A seal, perhaps. Something to keep. Something at bay. Tom, standing by the broken window, gazed out into the fog that clung to the cliffs below. The fog comes from here, he said quietly, as if speaking to the mist itself. This place is cursed. We were never meant to live here. The others stared at him, their unease growing. Father Emery frowned. What are you saying, Tom? Tom turned to face them, his eyes dark with understanding. The villagers, they broke the seal. The ritual stopped, and the sea took its revenge. The fog isn't just a warning. It's a judgment. As he spoke, the fog outside began to shift. It thickened, swirling in strange, unnatural patterns. Shadows moved within it, dark figures, the same ones they had seen creeping through the village. But now they were closer, their forms more distinct. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were something more. They're coming, Matthew whispered, his voice trembling. We shouldn't have come here. Father Emery stood, clutching the pendant in his hand. We must leave, he said, his voice urgent. Whatever was sealed here, it's waking. But as they turned to descend the stairs, the ground beneath them trembled. A low, guttural sound echoed through the lighthouse, like the deep rumble of something stirring far below the earth. The hum in the air grew deafening, vibrating through their bodies, as though the very walls were alive with it. The fog outside pressed closer, wrapping itself around the lighthouse in a suffocating embrace. The shadows moved faster now, their forms twisting, crawling toward the entrance. There was no escape. The fog had claimed them, just as it had claimed the others. And now, as the light faded from the broken lantern above, the darkness within the fog began to spill out. A living thing, hungry and ancient, rising from the depths to take back what had been stolen from it so long ago. The fog was no longer just mist. It was alive, pressing in on all sides, curling around the lighthouse like a cold, suffocating hand. The thick air stifled every breath, and the hum that had haunted the village now vibrated through the walls, growing louder, more intense, like the sound of something vast and ancient awakening beneath them. Tom stood frozen at the top of the lighthouse, his eyes fixed on the swirling fog below. The figures, those strange, twisted shadows that had haunted the village for days, were no longer distant shapes. They moved with purpose now, crawling up the cliffside, their long limbs jerking and twisting in unnatural angles, drawing closer with every heartbeat. We have to go, Father Emery urged, his voice tight with fear as the ground beneath them rumbled. The ancient symbols on the floor of the lighthouse seemed to pulse with a dark energy, glowing faintly in the dim light. If this seal was meant to keep something contained, we've disturbed it. We need to get out of here now. Tom tore his gaze from the fog and nodded. The others had already started down the spiral staircase, their lanterns swinging wildly in the thickening darkness. Each step felt more treacherous than the last as the lighthouse trembled, its stone walls groaning under the pressure of something unseen. The fog was no longer content to stay outside. It seeped through the cracks, curling along the walls like tendrils of smoke, reaching for them. Matthew stumbled, gripping the rail as he peered down the stairs. I can't see the bottom," he shouted, his voice laced with panic. The fog had filled the staircase, swallowing the steps below, transforming the descent into a black, endless void. "We can't stop!" Tom yelled from behind. "Keep moving!" They pressed on, but the fog was relentless, growing thicker with every step. The hum was deafening now, a constant vibration that reverberated through their bones. Shadows flickered in the mist, dark shapes slithering just out of sight, always watching, always waiting. By the time they reached the bottom, the entrance was gone, swallowed by the fog. Where the door had once stood was now a swirling wall of white, dense and impenetrable. Father Emery held up his lantern, but the light was swallowed almost immediately, vanishing into the mist. "We're trapped," Edgar whispered, his voice shaking. "We're trapped in here." Panic surged through the group as the realization set in. The fog had cut off their escape, and the strange figures in the mist were closing in. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly until their breath came out in frosty puffs. Father Emery gripped the pendant he had taken from the floor upstairs, his knuckles white. "There has to be a way out," he said, his voice trembling. "The fog. It's connected to the seal. If we can find a way to reclose it." His words were cut off by a loud creaking sound, and the lighthouse itself seemed to groan under the strain of the dark power swelling around them. The fog pulsed, as though responding to their fear, and a deep, guttural noise echoed from somewhere beyond the mist. It was a sound unlike anything they had ever heard, low, ancient, and filled with a hunger that sent chills through their bones. Suddenly the ground trembled violently, and from the fog, one of the figures emerged, its form twisting and elongating as it stepped forward. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs that dragged across the ground. Its face, if it had one, was hidden in the swirling mist, but its presence was undeniable. It radiated malice, an ancient hatred that seemed to fill the air with an oppressive weight.